Is there anything in your life you regret not valuing until it was too late? Share your thoughts and hit the like button if this story resonates with you. Subscribe to Narratives and Memories for more tales of regret and redemption. Alejandro stood before the bathroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie, just as he always did before an important event. The lights in the room reflected his impassive face, and for a moment, he felt that familiar sensation, the need for everything to be perfect, the fabric of his suit, his impeccable hairstyle, his upright posture. In that instant, he considered himself the center of attention, the man everyone wanted to meet, the one who commanded respect and admiration. However, something bothered him, though he didn't want to dwell on it too much. Isabel, his wife, was in the living room, almost invisible in her discreet black dress, which she had always chosen with modesty. Her beauty wasn't striking, but in her gaze there was a serenity he had always admired, though he rarely expressed it. Alejandro glanced at her from the hallway. She looked nervous, as always, before high-profile events. He didn't share those kinds of anxieties, but despite everything, destiny had been clear in his life. She would be the perfect wife, but not the partner to showcase in those circles where physical and social perfection mattered more than anything else. That event was crucial for Alejandro, a gala dinner where high-level businessmen, executives from important companies, and influential political figures would gather. It was the kind of place where deals weren't closed just with contracts, but with gestures, smiles, the way one moved through the crowd. Isabel didn't understand that part of him, didn't share it, and that weighed on him. Why can't she be more like the others, he often thought, though he never said it openly. It wasn't that he didn't love her, she simply didn't fit the image he wanted to project. And that night, more than ever, he felt he needed something different, someone to accompany him in his ascent to power. "Would you like to come to the gala with me tonight, Isabel?" Alejandro asked, not so much out of genuine interest, but out of a superficial obligation. Isabel looked up from the book she was reading with a slight smile. "Of course, dear. Do you think you'll be late?" she asked, as always, concerned about the smallest details, not fully understanding the importance of the event. Alejandro nodded, but his mind had already made a decision. His gaze drifted to the mobile phone resting on the coffee table, where he had an unread message. It was from Clara, a seductive young woman he had met at a work meeting months ago. Clara was exactly what Alejandro needed for that night, the perfect image of what he thought his life should be. An ambitious, elegant, sophisticated woman. At first he thought it was just an affair, a passing distraction, but Clara had captivated him with her intelligence, her ability to manipulate conversation, and her confident attitude. She wasn't just a mistress. Clara knew how to pull the strings of power, and Alejandro had begun to see in her an opportunity that would give him faster access to the elite he so desired. "Isabel," he said, in a tone meant to be gentle, "I don't think it'll be possible for you to accompany me tonight. The event is very exclusive, and it's not suitable for a woman like you. Well, you know, sometimes appearances are everything." Isabel looked at him with surprise, but said nothing. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but something inside her told her that this night was going to be different. She slowly stood up, with that calm that had always characterized her, and walked to her room. Alejandro thought that in that moment he had lost her, but he didn't care. He was determined to enjoy the gala with Clara, and in his mind, the idea of Isabel being there, with her simple demeanor and social awkwardness, simply didn't fit with what he needed to project that night. As Alejandro prepared to leave, Isabel walked past him, without looking directly at him. In her eyes, something more than sadness was reflected. There was a decision he couldn't comprehend. Isabel had always been much more than his wife. She represented the constant in his life, the person who had given him stability and unconditional love. But in his mind, Alejandro had begun to see her as a burden, as someone who tied him to a life he no longer wanted to live. "Have fun, Alejandro," Isabel said, her voice sounding more like a farewell than anything else. She didn't ask anything else. She had already understood that he made his decisions without considering what she thought, and deep down, she knew that that night would mark a breaking point in their lives, a point where the differences between them would be irreconcilable. As Alejandro left the house, Clara sent him a message confirming her attendance. The text was brief, but full of subtle promises of what could happen that night. Alejandro smiled to himself, anticipating what was to come, oblivious to the storm that would unleash in his life, and that, finally, would force him to face what he had been ignoring for so long. Isabel, in her room, looked in the mirror. She knew something had to change, but she didn't yet know how. Meanwhile, Alejandro was about to immerse himself in an experience that would leave him speechless, a revelation no one could have foreseen. At that gala, something very profound was about to happen, something neither he nor Isabel could have imagined. But that night, the pieces of destiny were already in motion. Do you think Isabel's calm reaction was a sign of inner strength or quiet resignation? What would you have done in her situation? Let me know your thoughts below. Isabel sat on the edge of her bed, the soft light of the lamp illuminating her pensive face. She couldn't stop thinking about Alejandro's attitude. That coldness, that indifference disguised as courtesy, something in his words had resonated with her in a deep and painful way. However, it wasn't the first time she had felt it. Over the years, she had learned to recognize the moments when her husband pulled away, when his gaze became distant and his words became emptier. It wasn't an abrupt process, but gradual, like the slow wear and tear of something used too much. She took a deep breath, observing her reflection in her dressing table mirror. She looked calm, serene, but inside her there was a chaos she never spoke of. Isabel had grown up in a humble family, full of love and sacrifice. Her mother always taught her that the most important thing in life was honesty and mutual respect. However, throughout her marriage, Isabel had felt those values fade in her relationship with Alejandro. She had wanted him to understand that her beauty resided not only in superficiality, but he had never seen her beyond her simple face, her quiet nature. She was the perfect wife for the home, but she had never been allowed to be anything more in his public life. As she got up from the bed, she went to the small desk where she kept her letters and notes. She didn't want to think about it anymore, so she began to organize some papers to distract her mind. But suddenly, one of the papers on the table caught her attention. It was an invitation to the evening's event, but not in the way she expected. It had arrived in an unconventional manner, an elegant envelope that came by mail. That envelope wasn't typical of the events Alejandro usually attended. It was a private invitation from Gabriel, the tech magnate whom Alejandro respected so much. Gabriel had been one of the first to show Isabel respect and consideration in that world that seemed so distant and alien. He had heard about her through her work in a local charity organization, and, without Alejandro's knowledge, had made some recommendations for Isabel to be recognized in certain circles. Isabel looked at the invitation carefully. Something inside her told her that this night would be different. Despite everything that had happened in her marriage, Isabel still wished to recover the essence of the love she had lost. She knew she had to assert herself in her own right, not as Alejandro's wife, but as the woman who had built an independent life full of achievements he never valued. That night, her destiny did not depend on what Alejandro did or his betrayals. It was time to be true to herself. She dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, one she had saved for special occasions, one she knew projected her true essence. She wanted her presence to be subtle but impactful. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to draw attention. She just wanted those who saw her to understand that she was not just Alejandro's wife, but a woman with her own purpose. As she got ready, her mind returned to the conversation she had had with him that morning. Alejandro's indifference hurt her, but in a way, it no longer surprised her. He had changed, and she had too, only not in the way he expected. Isabel left the house before Alejandro, who was still in his office getting ready for the event with Clara. She didn't want him to know that she was aware of what was about to happen, but her decision was made. She wasn't afraid, though her heart pounded. The road was quiet, almost deserted at that hour, and her mind was focused on what was about to happen. Isabel had never been a woman of open confrontations, but something inside her told her she had to take control of her life, now or never. When she arrived at the event, Isabel felt overwhelmed by the crowd of people jostling in the lobby. However, she was not intimidated. Her presence was noticeable from the first moment. Gabriel greeted her with a sincere smile, recognizing the natural elegance she had always possessed. The conversation with him flowed easily, full of respect and admiration for her work and achievements. Meanwhile, Alejandro had not yet arrived, and she allowed herself to enjoy the moment, knowing that something was about to change. In the main hall, the soft light of the chandeliers fell upon the round tables, where guests gathered in lively conversations. Isabel moved discreetly, not seeking attention, but her posture and elegance drew notice. By the time Alejandro arrived with Clara by his side, Isabel had already established a presence that did not go unnoticed. Alejandro saw her from a distance, and for a moment their eyes met. Something changed in his face, a flicker of surprise and perhaps remorse, but he quickly hid it behind his facade of confidence. Clara, by his side, quickly observed Isabel, noting her composure and the attention she was beginning to receive. "Who is she?" Clara asked, without hiding her curiosity, but with a slight smile on her lips, as if trying to belittle her. "Don't worry," Alejandro replied coolly. "She's just my wife." But inside, Alejandro wasn't so sure. Isabel was not the same submissive woman he had left at home. She was there for more than just being his wife. That night, though he didn't know it, she had come to reclaim what had always been hers, her dignity, her place, and the freedom to be who she truly was. In that moment, Isabel had no fear. She knew it was time for Alejandro to finally see who she really was, without more masks, without more doubts. The night was just beginning, but something big was about to happen, and neither of them, Alejandro nor Clara, knew it yet. Do you believe Isabel's decision to attend the gala on her own terms was a turning point? How do you think this will impact Alejandro's perception of her? Share your thoughts. The gala was in full swing. Guests glided through the hall like elegant shadows. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, while the crystal chandeliers reflected the candlelight. Isabel stood in a corner of the hall, observing with calculated calm. Gabriel, always attentive and cordial, had introduced her to the most exclusive circles of the evening, but she wasn't seeking attention. Her presence was already becoming noticeable without her needing to force it. Alejandro arrived with Clara by his side, his slender figure standing out in the crowd. When they entered, the murmurs ceased for a moment, and several heads turned to observe them. Clara, as always, did her best to draw attention, her laughter echoing in every corner of the hall, while Alejandro maintained a perfect facade, but his eyes searched for something in the room. A moment later, his eyes met Isabel's. Isabel stood, a glass of wine in her hand, her face serene, but with a palpable strength that Alejandro had not anticipated. For a second, something inside him churned. Isabel was not the same timid, submissive woman he had left at home. The woman now in front of him exuded a confidence he had never seen in her, a presence he could not ignore. Gabriel approached her with a smile and a knowing look, as if he knew exactly what was going through Alejandro's mind. "How are you, Isabel?" Gabriel asked, with a genuine kindness. "Very well, Gabriel. Thank you for inviting me." Isabel's voice was soft but firm, as if she were in control of the situation, which made Alejandro uncomfortable. Isabel smiled politely, but her dark, deep eyes never lost sight of Alejandro, who was now clearly uneasy, feeling the situation slipping out of his hands. Clara, on the other hand, was distracted in a conversation with other guests, and didn't seem to notice the tension beginning to form between the two. Alejandro took a few hesitant steps towards Isabel, as if he wanted to talk to her, but stopped when he saw Gabriel close to her, chatting as if they were old friends. That made him more uncomfortable than he would like to admit. Years ago, he had always been the center of attention, the man who decided whom to listen to and whom to ignore. But that night, Isabel was taking stage without needing to make a single effort. At that precise moment, Clara approached, noticing the distance that had grown between Alejandro and her. "Is everything all right, darling?" Clara asked, not hiding her tone of concern, though also some discomfort. "Something seems to be bothering you." Alejandro looked at her, trying to hide what he felt, but he couldn't help but feel trapped. The situation was out of his control, and his ego, hurt by Isabel's serene and almost haughty attitude, began to resurface. Clara, for her part, noticed it, but said nothing. She knew Alejandro had an internal struggle, but she also had her own plans. Clara approached the group of closer businessmen, leaving Alejandro with his thoughts and growing discomfort. Isabel, for her part, was enjoying every moment. She wasn't doing it out of revenge, but as a way to take control of her life, to give Alejandro back what he had always denied her, her own worth, her independence. As she watched Clara, she thought to herself that perhaps Alejandro would never understand what she had been able to achieve. Meanwhile, her presence at that event was not only a declaration of independence, but a reminder that she did not depend on him to shine. Gabriel, noticing the interaction between Alejandro and Isabel, took the opportunity to make a low comment. "Did you know that Isabel has worked on social impact projects that have helped many people? Some of those projects have been fundamental to some of the companies here tonight." Alejandro looked at him surprised, not knowing how to respond. For years he had ignored Isabel's passions, always taking it for granted that her achievements were nothing compared to his own. Now, that information hit him hard. Isabel, the woman he had underestimated, was connected to the people he considered indispensable, to the very circles he had tried to conquer all his life. "No, I didn't know," Alejandro replied, his voice lower than he would have liked. The disbelief was evident in his tone, and that disturbed him even more. Gabriel observed his reaction, smiling slightly. "I think it's time you start seeing Isabel with different eyes, Alejandro. She's not just your wife. She's a woman capable of much more than you imagine. Perhaps it's time to start giving her the respect she deserves." Gabriel's words resonated in his mind. For years, Alejandro had ignored Isabel, not only as a wife, but as a woman with interests, ambitions, and a capacity he had never given due recognition. As he thought about it, an uncomfortable feeling of guilt began to emerge. He had not only failed as a husband, but also as a person. The night continued, and although Alejandro tried to maintain his composure, Gabriel's words kept circling in his head. Isabel, however, did not seem to notice his distress. She was conversing with a group of businessmen, laughing and participating in a conversation that seemed not to include him. Despite the emotional distance that had always existed between them, Alejandro began to feel that Isabel no longer depended on him. The woman he had known, the one who had always been his silent support, was now a powerful, independent woman who did not need his validation to be successful. Clara, seeing the tension between them grow, decided to intervene. She approached Alejandro with a smile on her face, but her words failed to soften the atmosphere. "Are you okay?" Clara asked, gently touching his arm. Alejandro looked at her for a moment, and although his response was a fake smile, his thoughts were far away. His mind was completely occupied with Isabel, with what she now represented, and with what he had lost without realizing it. Isabel, for her part, had already left behind the insecurities she once had. As she looked at the crowd, she realized that it wasn't just her presence that mattered that night, but what she was capable of achieving without having to hide behind her husband's figure. That night, Isabel was not just Alejandro's wife. She was her own being, free and powerful. And although Alejandro didn't yet understand it, he would soon realize that nothing would ever be the same. What impact do you think Gabriel's words had on Alejandro? Do you believe Alejandro is truly starting to see Isabel in a new light? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The night continued its course amidst laughter, lights, and conversations. The murmurs of people intertwined like a distant echo, while the air conditioning kept the atmosphere cool and wine glasses circulated. Isabel, oblivious to the commotion surrounding Alejandro and Clara, continued to enjoy her place at the event, with a calm that made her husband uncomfortable. He, for his part, looked around, as if searching for something that would give meaning to all this, as if he wanted, somehow, to regain the control he felt he had lost upon arrival. Isabel's conversation with the tech entrepreneurs had flowed naturally, effortlessly. She had earned the respect and admiration of those she was talking to. Meanwhile, Clara, realizing the interaction between Isabel and the other guests, couldn't help but feel uneasy. It wasn't just that Isabel was receiving attention, it was that she was gaining something Clara had never achieved, the genuine respect of the people who truly mattered. The small circle in which Alejandro and Clara moved was well established, but Gabriel's words kept resonating in Alejandro's head. "It's time you start seeing Isabel with different eyes." That phrase had sown a seed of doubt in his mind. Alejandro, despite trying to concentrate on his conversation with other executives, couldn't stop looking at Isabel. She was distant, but her presence was so powerful that everything in the room seemed to gravitate around her. Every time their eyes met, a mixture of complex feelings invaded him. Jealousy, regret, admiration. The Isabel he had left at home, that woman who accepted his indifference, was no longer there. In front of him stood a woman who had reinvented herself, who had taken control of her life without needing him. "Everything all right?" Clara asked, gently touching his arm, trying to get his attention. Alejandro didn't look at her immediately. He was completely absorbed in his thoughts. Clara, seeing his bewilderment, took him by the arm and turned him towards her. "Alejandro, what's wrong with you?" Her tone was firmer now, and it was clear she wasn't willing to leave him alone. Finally, Alejandro looked at her, trying to hide the discomfort he felt. "Nothing, just..." He hesitated for a moment. "I'm just thinking." Clara, noticing the tone of doubt in his voice, couldn't help but feel hurt. She thought her relationship with Alejandro was strong, that he was completely dedicated to her. But that night, something had changed. Something she couldn't understand. "What's happening is that Isabel," Alejandro began, but stopped when he saw Clara staring at him, waiting for an answer he didn't have. "Isabel?" Clara asked sarcastically. "Now you're worried about her?" Alejandro didn't answer immediately. He felt trapped between the desire to defend his relationship with Clara and the need to understand what was happening with Isabel. It wasn't just that she was receiving more attention. It was that she was shining with a light he had never seen in her. Meanwhile, Isabel, who had noticed the exchange between them, decided it was time to speak. She approached Alejandro and Clara with a calm that disconcerted both of them. Her eyes shone with a confidence she had not shown until then, and her posture was firm, as if she had decided she would no longer be invisible to him. "Are you two doing well?" Isabel asked, looking at Clara and then at Alejandro, with a smile that didn't hide a touch of irony. Clara, seeing Isabel approach with such presence, frowned. She didn't expect her to intervene in her conversation with Alejandro, much less with that increasing confidence. "Everything's fine, thanks," Clara replied with a forced smile, though her eyes clearly reflected the disdain she felt. Alejandro, noticing the tension in the air, felt even more uncomfortable. He didn't know how to handle the situation. He didn't know how to face this new Isabel, this woman who had begun to challenge his vision of things. Isabel didn't wait for a response. She walked towards a group of businessmen nearby, as if nothing had happened. Alejandro watched her leave, feeling a mixture of bewilderment and frustration. Meanwhile, Clara, though she tried to maintain her composure, was annoyed, not only with Isabel, but with Alejandro, for not knowing how to handle the situation. How could he be so distracted by a woman who had nothing to do with him anymore? The rest of the night passed slowly for Alejandro. Every time he tried to converse with someone, his thoughts returned to Isabel. It was clear that something had changed in her, and he couldn't understand why he hadn't noticed it before. He didn't understand why, despite everything he had done, she continued to defy his expectations, as if she were building a life that didn't include his presence. Gabriel, seeing the internal struggle Alejandro was facing, approached him after a while. "Everything all right?" Gabriel asked, with a calm smile. "Yes, everything's fine," Alejandro replied, though his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "It's just that Isabel has evolved a lot, hasn't she?" Gabriel said, looking around before focusing on Alejandro again. "She's no longer the same woman you left at home." Gabriel's words hit Alejandro like a bomb. He knew he was right, but he couldn't accept that Isabel had come so far without his knowledge. He had been too focused on his own ambition, on his own desire for recognition, to realize what was truly happening. "I don't know what's going on," Alejandro murmured, as if talking to himself. Gabriel looked at him intently, understanding what he felt, but knowing that Alejandro had to face the truth himself. "It's time you start valuing what you have, Alejandro," Gabriel said firmly. Alejandro looked at him surprised, but said nothing. His friend's words resonated in his mind as he watched Isabel from a distance, surrounded by people who respected her for who she was, and not for what Alejandro thought she should be. Meanwhile, Isabel continued to be the center of conversation, effortlessly, without needing to draw attention. She was there to do business, to show her worth. She didn't expect Alejandro to understand all of it immediately, but he would. Isabel knew that life couldn't remain the same, and that night would mark the beginning of something completely different. The clock struck midnight, and the gala came to an end. The lights began to dim, and guests started to leave. Alejandro, who had lost part of the night in his own thoughts, found himself facing Isabel, perhaps waiting for a response that never came. "Are you leaving?" Alejandro asked, trying to find a way to regain control. "Yes, I have things to do," Isabel replied, with a determined look. And with that, she left. Alejandro watched her leave the hall, feeling that something deep had broken between them. She was no longer just his wife. She was someone else, someone who had surpassed him. And the idea of losing her began to sink deep into his chest. That night, everything changed, and Alejandro was not prepared for what was to come. What do you think will be the immediate fallout of this night for Alejandro and Clara? Do you think Alejandro will confront his feelings about Isabel, or try to ignore them? Share your predictions. The night had come to an end, but Alejandro couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. As the guests began to leave the luxurious gala hall, he remained standing, motionless in the center of the lobby. His thoughts were a whirlwind of doubts and mixed feelings. He had arrived at that gala with Clara, but the atmosphere had completely changed when he saw Isabel, when he realized what she was truly capable of, what he had ignored all those years. In his mind, Isabel's image shone brightly, like a revelation that had left him speechless. She was no longer the submissive wife he had known, the woman who had always been by his side, who had supported him in silence. No, Isabel was now someone completely different, someone who had decided to take control of her life, no matter what Alejandro thought. And that deeply disturbed him. Clara, on the other hand, watched him from a distance with a mixture of disdain and concern. She knew something had changed, that Alejandro was no longer completely focused on her, and that made her feel insecure. After all, she had been the one by his side in the most difficult moments, the one who had accompanied him in his ascent to power. But now, all that seemed to crumble because of a woman who, according to Clara, had no right to destabilize their relationship. Alejandro finally left the hall. He bid a brief farewell to the few remaining attendees, and, without looking at Clara, headed for his car. He wanted to be alone. He needed to process what had happened, what he had seen, what he had felt. He got into the car without saying a word and closed the door forcefully. As he started the engine, his mind kept returning to Gabriel's words. "It's time you start seeing Isabel with different eyes." The words resonated in his head, over and over, like an echo that wouldn't leave him alone. How could he have been so blind? Isabel was not just the woman he had walked down the aisle with, the one who had quietly accompanied him for years. No, Isabel was an incredible woman, capable of changing the world, of conquering those whom Alejandro considered unattainable. And he had been a fool. He had been so caught up in his own ego and his need for approval that he never realized what he had right in front of him. When he arrived home, the automatic door opened, and the sound of the car engine shutting off was the only thing that broke the silence of the night. Alejandro slowly got out of the vehicle and walked towards the main door, as if he were facing something bigger than himself. He knew something had changed forever, but he didn't know how to confront it. Upon entering, he saw Clara sitting in the living room, arms crossed, staring at him. Nothing needed to be said. Clara already knew something had happened, something she didn't like. Alejandro looked her in the eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of guilt. "What happened?" Clara asked, in a tone that left no room for evasion. Alejandro couldn't lie to her, couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The words got stuck in his throat. How was he going to explain that he no longer knew what he wanted? How could he tell her that his world had turned a 180 degrees in a matter of hours? "Clara, I don't know how to explain it," he began, but his words crumbled. Clara watched him distrustfully. "You don't know how to explain it?" she repeated, as if listening to a cheap excuse. Alejandro sat on the sofa opposite her. There was so much he wanted to say, but it all seemed too complex, too heavy to put into words. The relationship with Clara, the relationship with Isabel, Everything had changed, but he still didn't know how to process it. "Isabel," he finally said, as if the mere act of saying her name partially relieved him. "Isabel is no longer the same woman I knew. She's not the same woman I have at home." Clara looked at him, surprised. That was the last thing she expected to hear. "What are you saying?" she asked, standing up from the sofa. Her tone was harder now, almost defiant. "What I'm telling you is that I've realized that Isabel isn't just my wife. She has her own life, her own achievements, her own path. And I haven't really been seeing her. I was so caught up in my own world that I didn't realize what I had." Clara was silent for a moment, processing what she had just heard. She couldn't believe what Alejandro was saying. She had been so clear with him, so direct, but now he was changing his mind, as if everything they had lived together no longer mattered. "So this is it," Clara finally said with an ironic tone. "Now, after all these years, after everything we've built together, you realize that Isabel is more than your wife." Alejandro didn't know how to respond. Clara's words hit him hard, but he couldn't deny it. He couldn't deny what he had seen, what he had felt seeing Isabel that night. She was a powerful woman, a woman who didn't need his approval to shine, who didn't need his support to move forward. And that had left him speechless. "I don't want you to think I'm leaving you, Clara," he finally said, looking at the floor. "But I realize I'm lost. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I want to continue with this." Clara looked at him, her eyes full of contained rage. "So that's it. After everything we've been through, you're leaving for a woman who's nothing more than a shadow of what you are." Her voice trembled with frustration. "Don't do this to me, Alejandro. Don't do this to me." But Alejandro couldn't give Clara an answer. He couldn't keep lying. Something had changed in him, something he couldn't ignore. Isabel had begun to occupy a place in his heart, a place that Clara had never completely filled. The tension in the air was palpable. Clara, hurt and furious, got up from the sofa and left the room without another word. Alejandro remained there, looking at the closed door, not knowing what to do. How had he reached this point? How had he allowed things to go so far? The night stretched on in silence, and Alejandro remained there, alone with his thoughts. He couldn't help but think of Isabel, of what he had learned that night. His life was changing, and he couldn't stop it. What would happen now? What would he do with everything he had discovered about himself and about her? Somewhere in his mind, Alejandro knew there was no turning back. The life he knew, the life with Clara, had ended, and although he didn't yet know it, what came next would be completely different. What does this confrontation with Clara reveal about Alejandro's character at this point? Do you believe his regret is genuine, or is he simply reacting to Isabel's newfound presence? Share your thoughts. Dawn arrived like a heavy curtain falling over Alejandro's thoughts. He woke up in his empty bed, a feeling of emptiness he had never felt before. Clara was no longer by his side, and although her absence was noticeable, the weight of his own regret was even heavier. There was something inside him pushing him towards a decision, one he couldn't ignore, but he didn't know how to approach. Hours passed, but Alejandro couldn't stop thinking about Isabel. The image of her at the gala, surrounded by respect and admiration, continued to haunt his mind. How could he have not seen it before? Isabel wasn't just his wife. She was much more than that. She had always been the soul of his life, and he had been too blinded by his own ego and the constant pursuit of power to realize what he had by his side. He got out of bed with a weight on his shoulders, the same one he had been carrying for years, but now it seemed heavier, more unbearable. He looked around, the same luxurious apartment that had always been his refuge, but now everything seemed empty, superficial. It didn't matter how grand or impressive the space was. None of it filled the void he felt inside. There were no calls from Clara, No messages. The silence on his mobile phone was even more painful. Alejandro knew he had made a mistake, but he also knew that wasn't the only battle he faced now. The challenge was deeper. He had to face what he had lost with Isabel, and the worst part was that he knew he couldn't go back. He left his apartment without a fixed destination, driven by a sense of urgency. He needed to see her, to talk to her, but he didn't know how or what to say. He had seen Isabel at that gala, but at that moment, he didn't understand his own life. Isabel had always been there, but he had never realized how important she was to him until he had seen her through the eyes of others, of people who valued her for who she truly was. He drove through the streets, not paying attention to signs or traffic lights. His mind was completely absorbed in memories of Isabel, in the conversations he had ignored, in the times she had shown him, without words, her unconditional support. How could he have been so blind? How could he have believed that his world was complete without understanding what Isabel truly meant? Finally, he arrived at the place where he knew he would find her. Isabel had spoken several times about her philanthropic work, about the causes she believed in, about the foundation she directed. She wasn't just a wife, not even a simple woman. Isabel had a mission, a purpose, something he had never managed to understand until now. Upon reaching the foundation building, Alejandro felt completely out of place. It was a simple space, but full of life and color, something that contrasted completely with the coldness of his own environment. He saw a couple of people entering, but he didn't stop to talk to them. He wasn't there for a formal visit. He just wanted to find Isabel. He quickly went up the stairs, and upon reaching the top floor, he found her. She was sitting behind her desk, with a pile of documents in front of her, working with concentration. She didn't see him enter, and that was what hit him hardest. Isabel, with her calm and determined gaze, was building a world without him, and he could only observe. When Isabel looked up and saw him, there was no surprise in her eyes. She wasn't angry, nor sad, nor happy. There was only a serene calm on her face, as if she had already accepted what was about to happen. "Alejandro," she said plainly, her voice soft but firm. He approached slowly, as if fearing that his presence might ruin the peace she had built in those last few months. He didn't know what to tell her. He didn't know how to begin to explain what he felt. "I'm sorry," he finally said, with a sigh. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how we got here, but I realize everything I've lost, everything I didn't see, everything I ignored." Isabel looked at him calmly, as if waiting for him to say something more, for him to be able to say what he truly felt. "I have failed you," Alejandro continued, now with a more broken voice. "I never gave you the value you deserved. I was always so focused on myself that I never realized how incredible you are." Isabel remained silent, but the slight tilt of her head was enough for Alejandro to understand that she had hurt him. She wasn't seeking revenge or reproaches. She just wanted him to understand what had happened, what that rupture meant. And although his words hurt him deeply, Alejandro knew he had to listen to them. He had to face the truth. "Isabel, I don't know what to do now," he said, his voice full of desperation. "I've lost you, and I know it, but I'm here. I want to try something, anything. Just tell me what I can do to fix all this." Isabel looked at him for a long moment, and for an instant, Alejandro thought she might simply tell him it was too late. But she didn't. Her gaze wasn't full of hatred or contempt. It was full of a serene sadness, as if she had accepted that things don't always work out the way one expects. "Alejandro," she finally said, in a whisper that seemed almost an echo. "What has happened between us cannot be changed. I have also failed in some way, but I am no longer the same, and I believe you aren't either." Isabel slowly got up from her chair, walking towards the window, looking out with a calm that disconcerted Alejandro even more. Life changes, Alejandro. People change. And although I still appreciate you, I can no longer continue living in the past. I can no longer continue waiting for you to see me for who I am. I can no longer be your shadow. Her words hit him with a force he didn't expect. Each phrase was like a reminder that what he had lost. But he also knew that he couldn't keep clinging to the idea that he could fix everything with simple apologies. Isabel had already taken the step towards her own life, a life that did not depend on him. "And now what?" Alejandro asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "Now you go your way, Alejandro," Isabel replied, turning her gaze back to him, with an expression that was neither sad nor angry, but simply firm. "And I go mine." The silence that followed was deep, dense, like a farewell without words. Alejandro knew there was nothing more to say, that the decisions had already been made, that things would not go back to what they were. He remained there, looking at Isabel, watching her move away from him, like a figure beginning to fade on the horizon, leaving behind everything she once meant. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Alejandro was left alone in the room with the weight of his own regret crushing him. There was no turning back. What do you think is the biggest lesson Alejandro learned from this entire experience? How do you feel about Isabel's final decision? Share your thoughts on this powerful ending.